Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the DnPGamingCast. This is a little podcast where we go over every episode of Dan and Phil Games, starting at the very beginning. If this is the first episode that you are listening to, there is one other one that is up at the moment, and that is the first ever Dan and Phil Games video. And if you're joining us again from the first episode, thank you for coming back. I'm trying to make this episode a little bit more chill. I was very, very nervous during episode 1 because I don't love the sound of my own voice. And I'm also very much a note taker. So I had like 6 pages of notes for one video, and it was very overwhelming. And so this time I stuck to 1 page of notes. That is just the basics. Everything else, we're just going off of those notes. So I hope you enjoy, and we're going to get right into it. So I do like to write out a description for each Dan and Phil video, just so we can go over what it was all about in case anyone is listening to this without watching that first. This is probably the worst description I've ever written of anything in my entire life, but who cares? But the first Dan vs. Phil video is called Button Bashing Pros Dan vs. Phil Mortal Kombat Trilogy. This video has 2.3 million views and was uploaded on September 14th, 2014. First of all, the description on the actual video. We challenge each other head to head at Mortal Kombat Trilogy in our first official Dan vs. Phil. It was incredibly unfair, but justice was arguably served. This video will teach you the dangers of penguins. Also, you can totally get hurt playing with tinfoil. It adds on the bottom that they filmed the entire video and then realized the mics weren't turned on, which is why the video sounds worse than Donkey Kong. And this is something that I actually wrote in my notes before seeing that description. But getting into the actual video, Dan and Phil start off by introducing the first ever Dan vs. Phil, saying the gaming channel is a way to be both gaming together and against each other. Dan knocks Phil with the board, and the idea of Dan and Phil Crafts begins. Honestly, I have no idea what's going on through half of this video. I rewatched it multiple times and still have no idea what's happening. There's a lot of fighting though, and Phil wins round 1. Then round 2 begins. Dan says a character named Sonya is boring and then quickly adds that he had a crush on her before, which makes all the sense in the world, doesn't it? Round 2 involves more fighting and some more fighting, and then Dan wins. They change characters again and start round 3. Shockingly, there's more fighting. Who knew? And then Dan officially wins the first Dan versus Phil. Phil then tinfoils Dan's head, and Dan exclaims that that could seriously injure him. So Phil tests the theory out on himself. Making fun of Phil's age, Dan tells Phil that he beat him at a game that Phil has 4 decades of experience at, and I am reminded why we always loved it when Dan lost a Dan versus Phil. So first off, this was the first Dan versus Phil, which is thrilling. I always loved the Dan versus Phil videos, and I always loved, because on Tumblr, all the people that I followed at least, it was a big thing of wanting Phil to win. Everyone preferred Phil to win, and I really understood that by rewatching this video. But also, we get the beginning of the board, the middle section of the table, Dan versus Phil board. And that actually reminded me of the center of the dining table that we have at my house. We actually, growing up, me and my sisters always wrote underneath that middle section of the table. So we've got like a ton of notes under the middle section of our table. And I don't know why, like, that moment of them holding up the table, it like brought all that back to my head, which I hadn't really thought about in a while. So that has nothing to do with Dan and Phil, but that's what that reminded me of. And then we got the beginning of Dan and Phil Crafts, where you have to think, did they think of this back then and then decided like that is something that we have to do for April Fools? And the amazingness of Dan and Phil Crafts, it can't be beat. Honestly, like I went back and I rewatched Dan and Phil Crafts, and it's just as incredible now as it was back then. Top tier content, honestly. But getting into the actual game, Dan says that Sonya Blade, whoever that is the most boring character, and then he suddenly has a memory that imagine quotation marks around memory of having a crush, more quotation marks, on her. And I'm I was dying watching this in 2021, thinking how far we've come and how different them playing video games nowadays would be to what it was at that time. It's kind of sad too, but also kind of funny. With that, Phil quickly changes the subject of the little crush, and we move on to actually playing the game. Again, like I said in the description, I have no idea what's going on in this game. I could not concentrate on the game itself. I watched it over and over. I'm like, I need to know what's happening here. And I never knew what was happening. I don't care for fighting games, and I don't know. I couldn't. I don't care for fighting games. Um, I also wrote a small note that I thought Dan's laugh is so loud but sweet. And that is something that I have thought forever. He has the loudest laugh. If I'm listening with headphones, I have to like quickly turn the volume down every time he laughs or whenever I know he's about to lose. And but it's also such a contagious laugh. And I also thought the moment of Phil wrapping Dan's head in foil is hilarious because you can really just tell that Phil is like so over Dan being extremely dramatic. And I also wrote at the very end, thank God they changed their hair. I honestly cannot handle emo hairstyle anymore. And that used to be such a thing. Like I watched Dan and Phil before they changed their hair. I think whenever I started, Dan was just starting to let his go back curly. With Phil having his emo hair, and I didn't think anything of it at the time, but now that they have both like normal, gorgeous hairstyles, I go back and I watch like Phil's hair plastered down over his forehead, and I'm just like, oh, how did we do this? How did we get there? So that was the end of my notes. Honestly, there weren't many notes because I didn't care about the game. I still rated this video a 7 out of 10 because it is the first Dan versus Phil, and I think they have a lot of silly little moments in between of kind of ragging on each other. Um, but have I mentioned I dislike fighting games? Because I dislike fighting games. So I like to go back on the comments in each YouTube video and see what people were writing about or what they write about now with going back and rewatching like we're doing. And most of the comments were just quotes from the video, but there were quite a few from 4 years ago that they were having a marathon. And it was like one after another of who's having a marathon now, who's having a marathon now. And that was very interesting to see that it kind of goes in these waves of people wanting to kind of reminisce and go back and rewatch these Dan and Phil episodes. And some people were just going back and rewatching every Dan versus Phil, which is also a really fun thing, I think, to go back and do if you don't want to sit through every single Dan and Phil video to go back through all the Dan versus Phil. I also have some more people who answered questions from last week that I didn't get in time to add in the last podcast, so I wanted to go ahead and do that now. The first one I got, this person has been watching Dan and Phil for 1.5 years, so they're kind of new compared to where a lot of us came in at 4, 5, 6, and some, 10, 11 years ago. So I think it's just so interesting what their perspective of Dan and Phil, like what that could be compared to what the rest of us have. They also added that the first video of Dan and Phil that they watched was the Pottermore sorting video. They watched that back when they were in their Harry Potter phase, when the video had just come out. But the first one that they watched when they were actually a fan of them was the first charades video, which that's an incredible video to start with, in my opinion. A moment that Dan and Phil have helped them through, they said that there are so many, but the main one is that they currently have depression, and luckily they are working on their mental health now. But a few months ago, when they were at their lowest, Dan and Phil helped them believe that things can get better. And they say that they've met so many people because of Dan and Phil. They haven't been able to meet them yet in real life, but they do hope to one day. I then got another response through the email that I set up. If you don't have a Tumblr, you don't want to answer through Tumblr, you don't feel comfortable answering through YouTube comments, you can always go to DnPGamingCast@gmail.com and answer the questions through that. You have total privacy. Again, everyone remains anonymous unless they explicitly state that they want their name read. So that's just another way that you can answer the questions without ever, anybody else seeing it in the YouTube comments, or if you don't have a Tumblr, just going through that. But this person says that they've been watching Dan and Phil since October 5th, 2017. They're not sure why they remember the exact date, but that's actually incredible, and you have an amazing memory, and I'm jealous. So they've been watching them over 3 years. The first gaming video that they watched was The Twilight Zone, Dan and Phil Play Golf with Friends #3. And Golf with Friends is my absolute favorite of all of the series of videos that Dan and Phil did. That was my favorite. I was obsessed with the golfing ones. I always wanted more golfing. And that's what everyone knew me for on Tumblr, was my love of the golfing videos. But going on, a tough time in their life that watching Dan and Phil helped them through was when they first got into them. It was during a time in their life to distract them from thoughts of what people were thinking of them. They had become very quiet and closed off, and they felt like they were losing their friends, and their self-worth and confidence was very low. Watching Dan and Phil content always calmed their thoughts of self-hatred, and since some of their friends also liked Dan and Phil, they would always talk about them when things felt distant. And then with meeting friends through Dan and Phil, they have met some very lovely people through fan accounts on Instagram, but they haven't been able to meet them in real life. So thank you guys for sending in those answers to the questions. And there's going to be more questions in the description of this video. There'll be questions posted on Tumblr as well. And all the ways to answer my Gmail account will be added in the description of the video. And my Tumblr account will be added in the description of the video. And you can either comment on this video or go to my Tumblr or whatever you'd like to do to discuss this video further, your thoughts on Mortal Kombat. Do you like fighting games? Are they entertaining to you, or do you want to rip your hair out like I wanted to do? Thank you guys so much for joining me for the second podcast of so many to come. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. I'm always looking for ways to make this better or more interesting. I know it's just me talking, so I'm sure it gets a little irritating at times, but any ideas that you guys have for the podcast, if you want them to be longer, if you want them to be shorter, let me know. If you have certain questions you'd like to go over or anything at all, just send me a message on Tumblr, the Gmail, or in the YouTube comments, whatever you'd like to do. Thank you all for the responses I've gotten so far. I'm incredibly grateful and thankful for all of you. The next video is going to be on Portal Combat 2 Blindfolded. I haven't watched that video since probably 2016 or 2017. So it's going to feel like a first watch for me, and I'm going to try to have a better description for you. But I will probably fail at that, and that's okay, because we're all just hanging out and doing our best. Again, thank you all for listening. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for existing. Remember to always stay for dinner, and I'll see you next time.